This is my take on human rights today. While the concept of human rights has begun since time immemorial, it is but ideal to know that human rights is basically the same all throughout any other country or any state for that matter, and we are all entitled to the same basic human rights and freedoms since birth. The United Nations define human rights as rights inherent to all human beings regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, and even more. In the Philippines, based off of the report of World Report 2021, Human Rights Watch says that the situation of human rights in the Philippines has deteriorated ever since the presidency of then-President Rodrigo Duterte, saying that a lot of these human rights have been about killings due to EJK or extrajudicial killings because of the drug war. Much so that even the United Nations Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights published a highly critical report on the human rights situation in the Philippines, and of course creating an investigation regarding these EJKs. Reports on threats and attacks including killings, left-wing political activists, killings, environmental activists, as well as community leaders and indigenous peoples leaders, lawyers, journalists, and even more seem to have risen since this report has been made. There were Human Rights Watch monitorings that have also been taking place even during the lockdown affected by COVID-19 since 2020. This report also noted that there were numerous systematic human rights violations in the Philippines, especially amongst human rights defenders and activists. Red tagging is also very notable, especially in Facebook and other social media platform, wherein there were coordinated inauthentic behavior of dozens of people who created fake accounts in order to apparently spread government and military propaganda. On top of this, CEO Maria Ressa of the news website Rappler was convicted of cyber libel. And of course, there was the closure of one of the country's topmost broadcasting network, ABS-CBN, which was attributed to then-President Duterte's staunch negation of their stand as being a non-biased network in the Philippines. All of these have actually sent European Parliament overwhelmingly voting to adopt a resolution denouncing the rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in the Philippines and called the country to abide by its human rights commitment under the European Union's General Systems of Preference Plus program. On top of that, U.S. legislators seek to suspend the United States provision of security assistance to the Philippines just because of President Rodrigo Duterte's brutal regime using the pretext of the so-called anti-terrorism law to ramp up efforts targeting labor organizations, workers, and political opponents. They alleged that the military and police forces were found to have violated human rights and that there were rights of trade unionists, journalists, and human rights defenders, even indigenous persons, small farmers, LGBTI activists, and critics of the government that were violated as well by the government forces. Ironically, since President Rodrigo Duterte has stepped in, he has succeeded in increasing his satisfaction rate from 76% on his first year up to 91% on his last year of presidency, wherein he was loved by the people and he was also loved by the Philippine government and military forces. Not only that, President Duterte then bolstered the economy of the Philippines, tying up with several deals, treaties, and partnerships with different countries around the world, as well as private corporations that needed the boost of economy in our country. And of course, the ongoing efforts of the government to stop the CPP and PANDF from recruiting our very own youth from the public schools and even the private schools that they are trying to infiltrate in order to recruit youngsters to join the camps of the leftist groups and the Communist Party of the Philippines. With the thousands of projects that were started and completed during the Duterte administration, there can be no telling the many more government projects that are to be continued and even started during the presidency of Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. What's interesting is that for the layman or ordinary persons such as myself, and even for the marginalized sectors of our community or society in the Philippines, the morale has been up and the people's trust in the government has been completely turned around. And in fact, governmental offices and their services have also been bolstered to ensure that the Filipino people will receive what is due of them. Most of the human rights atrocities that now we see on television through news media outlets are actually done and initiated by terrorist groups such as the CPP and PA, who have been proliferating in our country for years. As we all know that human rights is a universal right of each and every living human being on earth, it is but our responsibility to not only uphold it but for ourselves but also uphold it for others and ensure that each and every person living on earth will have the right and will have the freedom and liberty to exercise what is due of him as a human being. And since human rights is not just an individual but a collective right and obligation to uphold, it is but rightful too that those who are in power and who have the capacity to help others uphold their own rights as citizens, as individual beings on this earth, that they too will be able to help bring out the justice, the liberty, the freedom that each human being should exercise. And most importantly, for those who needed it the most, those marginalized section or sectors of our community and society must also be uplifted in order for them to live the best life possible they can, exercising their freedom, their liberty, and their rights as rightful human beings. Only through collective, cooperative efforts shall we be able to have a sustainable living for each and everyone on earth.